For years, most Europeans built their picture of America almost entirely secondhand, through news broadcasts, viral clips, and the occasional Hollywood film, without ever actually setting foot in the country themselves. This World Cup changed that for millions of people at once, dropping them directly into American cities for weeks at a time instead of a few curated minutes on a nightly broadcast. What a huge number of these fans came back describing wasn't a slightly different version of what they expected. It was, in a lot of specific and repeated ways, a genuinely different country than the one they thought they were flying into. Before we get into exactly where that gap showed up, go ahead and subscribe now if you're into this kind of honest comparison between expectation and reality, since we'll be covering more of these first-hand reactions soon. To understand why so many fans reacted the way they did, it helps to look at what they were actually working with beforehand. European news coverage of the United States tends to lean heavily on specific categories of story, crime, political division, and dramatic isolated incidents, largely because those are the stories that generate attention and travel well across borders. That's not unique to how Europe covers America specifically. Most international news coverage of any country leans toward the dramatic and unusual, rather than the ordinary and mundane, since a calm Tuesday afternoon rarely makes for a compelling headline anywhere in the world. Over years of repeated exposure to this kind of coverage, though, a lot of European viewers had built up a mental image of the United States that was disproportionately shaped by its most extreme, headline-generating moments, rather than by what an average day actually looks like for most people living there. Several fans specifically described feeling like they were being handed a highlight reel of the worst things that had happened across an entire year, compressed into a steady stream of coverage that made those events feel far more common and far more representative than they statistically are. That's a fairly normal effect of how modern news cycles work everywhere. Attention naturally gravitates toward conflict and disaster, but it left a specific, measurable gap between the mental image these fans carried into the tournament and what they actually experienced once they arrived. A few media researchers who commented publicly on this trend pointed to a well-documented pattern sometimes called mean world syndrome, where heavy, repeated exposure to news coverage focused on danger and conflict leads audiences to perceive the world as considerably more threatening than it statistically is, an effect that isn't unique to coverage of America, but tends to apply broadly to how international audiences perceive any country they mostly experience through a screen rather than in person. Social media added another layer to this effect in recent years, since algorithm-driven platforms tend to surface the most emotionally provocative content specifically because it drives more engagement, further concentrating people's exposure toward extreme, unrepresentative examples rather than the far more mundane reality of daily life anywhere. A number of fans specifically mentioned this dynamic in their own reflections after the trip, describing a kind of realization that their pre-trip anxiety had been shaped less by any single deliberate act of misinformation and more by the simple mechanics of what kind of content tends to spread furthest and fastest online. Once fans were physically on the ground, the contrast between expectation and reality showed up almost immediately, and safety was the single most repeated example across an enormous number of separate accounts. Visitors who'd specifically braced themselves for tension or danger described walking through host city downtowns late at night without incident, past groups of teenagers simply talking on a corner, delivery trucks left unlocked overnight, and pedestrians going about ordinary business without anyone paying them much attention at all. It's worth being precise about this rather than overstating it. Crime in the United States genuinely does vary a great deal by city and by specific neighborhood, and a tourist moving primarily through well-maintained downtown cores and stadium districts is having a meaningfully different experience than someone living in a struggling part of the same metro area a short distance away. Fans from countries dealing with their own serious safety concerns, including visitors from parts of South Africa and Latin America, were especially struck by how relaxed public spaces felt in the specific American cities they visited. Women walking alone at night, minimal visible security at everyday businesses, a general absence of the tension they associated with similarly sized cities back home. None of this erases the real safety challenges that exist in specific parts of the United States, and no single month-long trip through a handful of host cities captures the full picture of a country this large and this varied. But for people arriving with a mental image built almost entirely from the most dramatic news coverage available, the calm, unremarkable reality of an ordinary evening out became one of the most repeated points of genuine surprise across the entire tournament. A few fans went as far as tracking their own changing comfort level over the course of the trip, describing an initial period of caution in the first few days, still half expecting something to confirm their prior assumptions, followed by a gradual, almost unconscious relaxation as day after day of ordinary, uneventful experience failed to match the tension they'd braced for. Local law enforcement in several host cities specifically leaned into this dynamic, with a number of departments running visible, friendly outreach efforts during the tournament, community events, casual patrols through fan zones, officers stopping to chat and take photos, partly aimed at counteracting exactly the kind of anxious first impression that international visitors sometimes arrive with. Whether that outreach effort meaningfully shifted opinions or whether it was simply a reflection of how these officers behaved day to day regardless of the tournament, several fans said it didn't especially matter. The actual lived experience of feeling safe was what stuck with them, regardless of exactly how much of it was organic versus specifically staged for a month of extra international attention. Beyond simple safety, a lot of fans described a specific gap between the emotionally cold, aggressive stereotype of Americans they'd absorbed from media coverage and popular culture, and the openly warm, curious people they actually encountered in day-to-day interactions. Small talk with strangers, something genuinely unusual in a lot of Northern and Central Europe, turned out to be a near-constant feature of daily American life. Cashiers asking how your day was going and waiting for an actual answer, strangers striking up conversations in elevators and checkout lines without any particular reason. Several fans specifically noted how differently local police interacted with visiting crowds compared to the tense, confrontational image they'd built up from news footage of isolated incidents, describing officers in more than one host city joining in celebrations, taking photos with fans, and generally projecting an approachable, relaxed demeanor rather than the more guarded posture they'd expected. Political division, a frequent subject of European news coverage about the United States, was something several fans specifically looked for and mostly didn't find reflected in their everyday interactions, describing conversations with locals from clearly different backgrounds and viewpoints that stayed friendly and centered on football rather than escalating into the kind of confrontation the news coverage back home might have suggested was constantly bubbling just under the surface. None of this means genuine political tension doesn't exist in the country. It clearly does and shows up regularly in domestic American coverage of its own politics. But the specific, day-to-day interactions these visiting fans actually experienced rarely match the more combative picture painted by international coverage, focused on the loudest and most extreme examples available. A number of fans specifically brought up how differently service industry workers treated them compared to the more transactional customer service culture common in a lot of European cities, describing wait staff, hotel employees, and retail workers who seemed genuinely invested in making their visit enjoyable rather than simply processing them efficiently through a routine interaction. Several visitors from countries with more reserved cultural norms around physical affection and casual compliments described feeling a little overwhelmed at first by how openly Americans expressed warmth toward strangers, being called sweetheart or honey by a waitress, receiving an unprompted compliment from someone in a checkout line, before eventually coming around to genuinely appreciating a level of openness they didn't have an equivalent for back home. That kind of casual warmth extended into more substantial gestures as well, with a number of fans describing strangers who noticed a lost or confused visitor and went well out of their way to help, driving someone to their hotel, walking several blocks to point out a correct turn, or simply spending extra time answering questions about the city rather than giving a quick, minimal response and moving on with their day. To be fair to the coverage these fans grew up watching, not every assumption they carried in turned out to be wrong, and it's worth acknowledging where the media's portrayal actually held up under direct experience. Portion sizes and consumer excess, a frequent subject of gentle European mockery, were confirmed almost immediately, with fans posting side-by-side comparisons of an American medium soda against what would be labeled a large back home, along with oversized vehicles and shopping carts that match the stereotype fairly closely. Political and cultural divisions genuinely do exist, and occasionally surfaced in visible ways, from campaign-style signage in certain neighborhoods to specific conversations where fans noted real, sometimes sharp disagreement among Americans about their own country's direction. Healthcare costs, another frequent talking point in European coverage of the U.S., were confirmed by several fans who either witnessed or heard directly from Americans about the financial stress tied to medical bills, a genuine structural difference from most European systems that didn't get exaggerated by the coverage at all. The scale of everything from highways to homes to retail stores also matched or exceeded what fans expected going in, suggesting that at least some categories of American stereotype are less about media distortion and more about an accurate reflection of genuine cultural and structural differences between the two continents. A few fans also confirmed more specific, narrower stereotypes tied to individual regions rather than the country as a whole, describing genuinely intense heat and humidity in parts of the South that matched every warning they'd been given, or confirming that certain cities really do have the kind of car-dependent layout that makes walking anywhere without a vehicle genuinely impractical, exactly as they'd read about beforehand. Gun culture, another frequent subject of European coverage, came up in a more nuanced way than expected, with several fans specifically visiting shooting ranges as a novelty tourist activity, an experience they described as interesting and well-supervised, while also acknowledging that broader debates around gun policy in the country are clearly more serious and more contested than a single recreational visit could ever fully capture. Bringing all of this together, the fair conclusion isn't that every assumption these fans carried in was wrong, some genuinely held up under direct experience, but that the coverage they'd grown up with had clearly overweighted certain categories, crime, conflict, and danger specifically, while underweighting the more mundane, positive, and frankly less newsworthy parts of daily life that ended up defining most of their actual trip. Putting all of this together, the honest explanation isn't that European media deliberately misleads its audience about America, it's that any news system, anywhere in the world, naturally gravitates toward the dramatic, the unusual, and the conflict-driven, simply because that's what holds attention and justifies continued coverage. A calm evening in a mid-sized American city with friendly strangers and functioning public infrastructure doesn't generate the same engagement as a dramatic story about crime or political conflict, so it rarely gets covered with anywhere near the same frequency, even though it likely represents a far more statistically common daily experience for most people living there. This isn't unique to how Europe covers America either. The same dynamic shapes how American media covers Europe and how most countries end up covering each other, generally an accumulation of the most extreme available stories standing in for a full picture that individual coverage was never actually designed to provide. A month-long, immersive trip through multiple cities gave these fans something that a nightly news segment fundamentally can't: direct, repeated, ordinary contact with a place, rather than a curated highlight reel of its most extreme moments. That's ultimately what closed the gap for so many of them, not that the news had been lying, but that the news had only ever shown them a specific, narrow slice of a much larger and more varied country. A number of communication researchers who study international news coverage specifically pointed out that this kind of gap tends to close fastest through exactly this type of large-scale, immersive contact, tourism, sporting events, cultural exchange programs, rather than through any single corrective news segment or documentary, since direct personal experience simply carries more weight with most people than secondhand reporting ever can, regardless of how accurate that reporting actually is. A few fans specifically drew a comparison to how their own understanding of other countries had shifted after previous travel experiences, noting that this same pattern, arriving with a media-shaped set of assumptions and leaving with a more nuanced, ground-level understanding, wasn't unique to America, but simply became especially visible this time because of how many people experienced it simultaneously during the same few-week window tied to a single, widely followed event. That scale is really what made this particular gap so noticeable and so widely discussed. Not that individual travelers hadn't had similar realizations about other countries before, but that a World Cup specifically compressed an enormous number of these individual realizations into the same narrow stretch of time, all surfacing publicly within weeks of each other. The more interesting question for a lot of these fans wasn't just noticing the gap, but figuring out what to actually do with that realization once they were back home. Several described making a conscious effort to be more skeptical of dramatic, attention-grabbing coverage about any country going forward, not dismissing it outright, but holding it a little more loosely until they had some additional context or, ideally, direct experience to weigh it against. A number of fans specifically encouraged friends and family back home to consider visiting themselves rather than relying entirely on second-hand accounts. Several going as far as helping plan return trips for people close to them who'd expressed hesitation about visiting America based on the same media-driven assumptions they themselves had walked in with a month earlier. A handful of content creators who documented their own journey from skepticism to genuine surprise have continued producing follow-up content specifically addressing questions from viewers who'd seen the shift and wanted more detail before making their own travel decisions, effectively turning their personal experience into a small, informal counterweight to the more dramatic coverage that had originally shaped their expectations. Whether this specific moment produces any lasting shift in how European media covers America, or simply fades as one especially memorable tournament story among many, the fact that so many individual people walked away with a genuinely revised understanding and were actively sharing that revision with others is itself a meaningful outcome regardless of how the broader coverage landscape eventually settles. A number of universities and cultural exchange organizations even took notice of the trend, with a few issuing statements encouraging more structured student and youth exchange programs, specifically because major events like this tournament had demonstrated, at scale, just how quickly first-hand exposure could reshape long-held assumptions between two regions that otherwise mostly interact through filtered, second-hand coverage of each other. Tourism boards in several host cities also picked up on the shift, incorporating some of the more viral fan testimonials into their own marketing efforts for the months following the tournament, betting that authentic, unscripted reactions from ordinary visitors would carry more persuasive weight with potential future tourists than any professionally produced advertisement ever could. That instinct seems to have paid off to some degree, since a number of these host cities reported a modest but measurable uptick in international booking inquiries in the weeks immediately following the tournament, at least some of it directly traceable back to the wave of surprised, positive commentary that had spread so widely during the event itself. So how much of your own picture of a country you've never actually visited do you think comes from headlines rather than lived experience, and does that match what these fans discovered here? Let us know your take in the comments, and if you've had a similar gap between expectation and reality on a trip of your own, we'd like to hear about it. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, hit like and subscribe so you catch the next one. This video is compiled from traveler accounts, public reporting, and general information for entertainment and discussion purposes, and it reflects a specific group of visitors' experiences rather than a complete picture of any single country.